The morning I was told, "Go rest, Mom," I thought it was kindness. But when I walked back through my front door earlier than expected, I found my home unrecognizable, cold, stripped bare, as if I'd never lived there at all. The woman who had raised 3 children in those rooms had been erased like dust from a forgotten shelf. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. I am Rose Kowalski. 82 years old, born and raised in this beautiful, brutal city of Chicago. For over 50 years, I lived in the same red brick bungalow on the north side, just blocks from where the elevated train rumbles past every 15 minutes like clockwork. The house sits on a tree-lined street where neighbors once knew each other's names, where children played hopscotch on summer evenings, where the smell of pierogies and Italian beef mingled in the air during block parties. But that morning in February, standing in my own living room, I felt like a stranger in a museum exhibit labeled "Life Before." The familiar warmth was gone. The photographs that had covered every surface for decades had vanished. The throw pillows my late husband Frank had bought me for our 40th anniversary were nowhere to be seen. Even the coffee table where I'd served countless meals to grandchildren doing homework had been replaced with something sleek and modern that looked like it belonged in a magazine, not a home. My hands trembled as I reached for the light switch. The lamp that had illuminated thousands of evening conversations was gone too. In its place stood a cold, minimalist floor lamp that cast harsh shadows across walls that had been repainted in sterile white. The cheerful yellow I'd chosen 20 years ago, the color Frank said reminded him of sunshine, had been covered completely. I sank into what used to be my reading chair, except it wasn't my chair anymore. This new one was firm where mine had been soft, angular where mine had been curved. It didn't know the shape of my body or the weight of my worries. It didn't hold the memory of countless nights spent waiting for phone calls that never came or watching late-night television because sleep wouldn't visit an anxious heart. The scent was wrong too. Instead of the gentle lavender sachets I kept in every room, instead of the lingering aroma of homemade bread and Frank's old aftershave that somehow still clung to certain corners, there was only the sharp smell of bleach and something artificial meant to smell like ocean breeze. As if my life needed to be sanitized away. For months leading up to that devastating February morning, I had been drowning slowly in exhaustion. Every day began before dawn with joints that ached like old hinges, shuffling through empty rooms that echoed with memories of laughter that felt increasingly distant. The silence had become so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat in the spaces between the passing trains. I would stand at my kitchen window, watching neighbors hurry past on their way to jobs and lives that mattered, wondering when I had become invisible. The mailman no longer waved. The woman across the street who used to chat over the fence had stopped making eye contact. Even the stray cat I fed every morning had found somewhere else to beg for scraps. Then came the phone call that I thought was a lifeline. "Mom, you sound tired." Diane's voice carried that particular tone I'd learned to recognize, the one that sounded concerned but felt calculating. "You really need to take it easy. Why don't you come stay with us for a few weeks? The kids would love to have Grandma around more, and you could rest. We'll take care of everything at your place." My daughter-in-law had always been careful with her words, wrapping sharp observations in soft concern. But that day, after weeks of waking up to empty rooms and eating dinner alone while the television provided hollow company, her suggestion felt like warm honey on a sore throat. "The guest room is all ready for you," she continued. "And Michael has been working so hard lately. He misses spending time with you too." Michael, my middle child, my gentle boy who had grown into a man who tried to keep peace at any cost. The one who had inherited Frank's kind eyes but seemed afraid to use them to really see anymore. The son who called every Sunday but spoke in rushed sentences as if checking items off a duty list rather than connecting with his mother. "I don't want to be a burden," I heard myself saying, the words that had become my automatic response to any offer of inclusion. "Don't be silly, Mom. You're family. We want to take care of you." Those words, "take care of you," landed in my chest like a key turning in a lock I didn't know had been waiting to open. When had someone last offered to take care of me? When had I last felt wanted rather than merely tolerated? I packed my suitcase that very afternoon, folding my warmest sweaters and the blue dress Frank had always said brought out my eyes, though no one seemed to notice my eyes anymore. I locked the front door with hands that shook slightly from anticipation rather than arthritis for the first time in months. The February wind cut through my coat as I waited for Michael to pick me up, but I barely felt the cold. I was too busy imagining family dinners where conversation flowed naturally, evenings spent helping grandchildren with homework while something delicious simmered on the stove, mornings where I might wake up to the sound of voices instead of silence. The fantasy burned so bright in my chest that I almost forgot how many times similar dreams had been extinguished. But standing in my transformed living room 6 weeks later, having returned early from what was supposed to be a restful stay with family, I remembered everything I had trained myself to forget. I remembered every time my hopes had been carefully built up only to be casually torn down. I remembered every promise that had dissolved like sugar in rain. I remembered every moment I had chosen to believe in change because the alternative was too painful to accept. The guest room at Michael and Diane's house had been warm enough, but the warmth hadn't reached me. Conversations happened around me rather than with me. Plans were made without consulting me. I became wallpaper with a pulse, acknowledged but not included, visible but not seen. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing while still breathing? Like you were becoming a ghost in your own life? My entire adult life had been built on the foundation of giving. Giving time, giving money, giving energy, giving pieces of myself until I sometimes wondered what was left underneath all that generosity. But looking around my violated living room, I realized that somewhere along the way, giving had become taking. My sacrifices had become expected. My love had become a currency that devalued with every transaction. Let me tell you about the weight of 50 years of putting everyone else first. In 1975, when Michael was 7 and struggling in school, I gave up my part-time job at the library to tutor him every afternoon. The smell of his crayon drawings and the proud smile when he finally mastered long division were payment enough, I told myself. But Frank and I had been saving for our first real vacation, planning to see the Grand Canyon. That money went to extra tutoring and school supplies instead. We never did make it to Arizona. When my eldest daughter Sarah went through her ugly divorce in 1998, she moved back home with her 2 toddlers for what was supposed to be 3 months. 18 months later, she finally left, but not before the constant chaos had driven Frank to sleep on the living room couch most nights. The man who had worked double shifts to give us a comfortable life spent his last healthy years listening to crying babies and mediating arguments between his wife and his daughter, never complaining but growing quieter with each passing month. Then there was the loan to Michael in 2010. $35,000 from our retirement fund, money Frank and I had saved penny by penny, dollar by dollar, for the quiet golden years we had promised ourselves. It's just temporary, Mom, Michael had said, standing in this very living room where someone had now erased every trace of the life Frank and I had built together. The business will be profitable within 2 years. You'll get every penny back with interest. That was 14 years ago. The business succeeded. Michael bought a bigger house, a newer car, took family vacations to Disney World and the Caribbean. But the repayment conversations grew shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether. When I gently brought it up at Christmas dinner 3 years ago, Diane's laugh was razor sharp. Oh Mom, you're not seriously keeping track, are you? After everything we do for you. Everything they did for me. Like allowing me to babysit their children when their regular sitter canceled. Like letting me contribute to family gift expenses for birthdays and holidays. Like permitting me to host holiday dinners until my arthritis made standing for hours too difficult, at which point the traditions moved to Diane's house and my attendance became optional. I learned to swallow my hurt and smile. I learned to make my needs smaller and my gratitude larger. I learned to apologize for caring and to thank them for tolerating my existence in their busy, important lives. But the basement discovery 6 months before that February morning had cracked something fundamental inside me. I was looking for Christmas decorations, the ones Frank and I had collected over 40 years of marriage. Each ornament held a story, a year, a memory of children's faces lit by tree lights and stockings stuffed with small treasures we could barely afford but gave with joy anyway. I knew exactly where they were stored, in the clear plastic bins labeled in my careful handwriting. The bins were there, but they were wrong. Too light. Too empty. Inside, I found broken pieces of glass angels and shattered ceramic Santas. The needlepoint stockings I had made for each grandchild, stitching by lamplight through countless December evenings, were torn and stained. The wooden nativity set Frank had carved by hand during his recovery from heart surgery was missing entirely except for one shepherd's staff, snapped in half. But worse than the destruction was what else I found in that bin. Photographs. Not just any photographs, but the most precious ones. My wedding pictures, torn down the middle so that Frank and I were separated even in memory. Baby pictures of my children, crumpled and scattered like confetti from a bitter celebration. The last photo Frank and I had taken together, at our 50th anniversary party, was completely destroyed, ripped into pieces too small to repair. Mixed in with the devastation were receipts, credit card statements, bank documents, all bearing my forged signature. My hands shook as I unfolded bill after bill, seeing my name signed in handwriting that resembled mine but wasn't quite right. Diane had been using my credit cards for months. Small purchases at first. Groceries, gas, children's clothes. But the amounts grew larger. A weekend getaway to Wisconsin Dells. New furniture for their kitchen. A deposit for their eldest daughter's college application fees. The total was over $8,000. Money I hadn't spent. Trips I hadn't taken. Purchases I hadn't made. That night, I sat on my kitchen floor with those destroyed memories scattered around me like snow that would never melt. The coffee cup I was holding slipped from my numb fingers and shattered against the worn linoleum, the pieces cutting into my palm as I tried to gather them up. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the crack that had opened in my chest, letting in a cold draft of understanding I wasn't ready to feel. For the first time in decades, I didn't clean up the mess. I left the broken ceramic and the torn photographs and the fraudulent receipts exactly where they fell and walked upstairs to my bedroom. In the mirror above Frank's old dresser, I saw a stranger. An old woman with wild gray hair and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. A woman who had been so busy giving that she had allowed herself to be taken from. The next morning, I made my first decision in years. I called the credit card company and reported the unauthorized charges. Then I called my bank and put a hold on all my accounts. Then I sat in Frank's old recliner and cried for 3 hours straight, mourning not just for what I had lost, but for how long I had let the taking continue. But even then, even with evidence of theft and destruction spread across my kitchen table, I wasn't ready to burn the bridges completely. When Diane called that afternoon with her honeyed offer of rest and relaxation, part of me still wanted to believe that family could be healed, that love could be repaired, that maybe I had misunderstood something fundamental about the situation. So I packed my suitcase and locked my door and climbed into Michael's car with hope sitting heavy in my throat like unshed tears. The 6 weeks at their house taught me the difference between being included and being invaded, between being loved and being managed. I woke each morning to the smell of coffee I wasn't invited to share and conversations that stopped when I entered the room. I offered to cook, clean, help with homework, anything to feel useful, but was told repeatedly that I should just rest, just relax, just let them handle everything. But I could see through their bedroom door at night, see Diane at her laptop, could catch glimpses of real estate websites, home renovation blogs, interior design portfolios. Could hear whispered phone calls about contractors and timelines and updating things. She won't notice, I heard Diane tell someone on the phone. She's getting too old to care about that stuff anyway. On the morning I decided to come home early, I told them I was feeling homesick, wanted to check on the mail, water the plants, make sure everything was secure. Michael drove me without argument, chatting about the weather and his work, asking if I was feeling rested, telling me how good it had been to have me around. But when he dropped me off at the front door and drove away with barely a glance back, I realized he hadn't looked me in the eyes during the entire ride home. The key still fit the lock. The door still opened. But the house I entered belonged to someone else. They had erased me completely. Not just moved things or cleaned up, but eliminated every trace of the woman who had lived and loved and sacrificed in those rooms for half a century. The walls were white, the furniture was modern, the photographs were gone. Even the kitchen, where I had prepared thousands of meals for this family, had been completely renovated. New cabinets, new countertops, new appliances. The window over the sink where I had watched seasons change and children grow was the only thing that remained from my version of home. I opened the refrigerator, expecting to find it empty, but instead found it fully stocked with expensive organic foods I had never bought and wine I didn't recognize. In the freezer, gourmet frozen meals replaced the carefully portioned leftovers and homemade soups I had always kept on hand. Even my bedroom had been transformed. The furniture Frank and I had chosen together was gone, replaced with something sleek and impersonal. The closet held clothes that weren't mine in sizes that didn't fit me. The bathroom drawers contained beauty products I had never purchased, medications that weren't prescribed to me. But the cruelest detail was the living room coffee table, where a neat stack of real estate brochures sat next to a folder labeled Senior Living Options. Bright, cheerful pamphlets full of smiling elderly faces and promises of community and care and all the activities I could want. All the evidence of a decision that had been made without me. I picked up one of the brochures with hands that no longer felt attached to my body. Sunset Manor. A lovely assisted living facility just 30 minutes away. The monthly cost was more than my entire Social Security check. The fine print mentioned that families often sold inherited homes to help finance the transition to a more appropriate living situation for seniors. That's when I understood. This wasn't neglect. This wasn't even ordinary manipulation. This was a carefully planned elimination. They weren't just stealing from me or lying to me or ignoring me. They were erasing me completely, preparing to ship me away so they could inhabit the life I had built without the inconvenience of my continued existence. I sat on the foreign couch in my own living room and felt something I had never experienced before. Not sadness. Not hurt. Not even anger. Something harder and cleaner and more dangerous than any of those familiar emotions. I felt done. Have you ever reached that moment? When the switch flips from hurt to finished. When you stop asking why and start asking what next. That night, I didn't call Michael to scream or cry or demand explanations. I didn't call Diane to confront her about the credit cards or the destroyed photographs or the complete violation of my privacy and trust. I didn't call Sarah or my youngest son David to tell them what their brother and sister-in-law had done to the home where they had grown up. Instead, I called a locksmith and had all the locks changed. Then I called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, an 85-year-old former school principal who had been watching my house for decades and knew exactly who had been coming and going in my absence. "Oh honey," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of witnessed betrayal. "I thought you knew. They've been here almost every day. Moving trucks, renovation crews, people measuring and photographing everything. Diane told me you had decided to move to one of those nice senior places and were getting the house ready to sell. She said you were too proud to ask for help, but they wanted to surprise you with how beautiful they could make it for the new buyers." The new buyers. As if my home was already gone, as if I was already dead, as if 50 years of memories could be painted over with primer and good intentions. Mrs. Patterson came over that evening with a casserole and a bottle of wine and the kind of righteous fury that only an old woman can muster on behalf of another old woman who has been wronged. We sat in my sterile living room while she told me everything she had witnessed during my absence. The destruction had been systematic and thorough. First, they removed all personal items, photographs, and what Diane called clutter. Then came the furniture, most of it donated to charity without any attempt to determine its sentimental or monetary value. Frank's antique desk, where he had paid bills and written letters for 30 years, went to Goodwill along with his books, his tools, his carefully maintained collection of jazz records. My china cabinet, the one my mother had given me as a wedding gift, was sold to an antique dealer for a fraction of its worth. The dining room set where we had hosted countless holiday meals was replaced with something modern and uncomfortable that photographed better, according to the interior designer Diane had hired. Even my garden was gone. The roses I had tended for decades, the vegetable patch where I grew tomatoes and herbs, the fruit trees Frank and I had planted to celebrate each child's birth, all ripped out and replaced with low-maintenance landscaping that required no care and provided no joy. They worked like they were racing against time, Mrs. Patterson told me, her voice tight with controlled anger. Like they were afraid you might come back and stop them. But the most devastating detail was what she told me about the day they took Frank's ashes. I had kept his urn on the mantelpiece, surrounded by photographs from our 50 years together. Nothing elaborate, nothing morbid, just a quiet memorial to a good man in the room where we had spent our happiest evenings together. During the renovation, Diane had decided that death imagery would be depressing for potential buyers and had moved Frank to what she called a more appropriate location, the basement. My husband, my partner, my best friend for half a century, had been relocated to a shelf between paint cans and Christmas decorations, boxed up like seasonal merchandise waiting to be stored or discarded. That's when I broke. Not the quiet, manageable tears I had been shedding for months, but deep, primal sobs that seemed to come from somewhere beneath my bones. Mrs. Patterson held my hand while I cried for Frank, for my stolen home, for my destroyed memories, for the naive woman who had believed that love and sacrifice would be enough to secure her place in her own family. When the crying finally stopped, something else took its place. Something Frank would have recognized from our early years, when I was young and fierce and hadn't yet learned to make myself smaller for other people's comfort. Determination. The next morning, I called the elder law attorney Mrs. Patterson recommended. Mary Morrison had built her practice around protecting seniors from exactly the kind of exploitation I was experiencing. Her voice was warm but businesslike when I described my situation. "Mrs. Kowalski, what you're describing is unfortunately common. Financial exploitation of elderly family members often escalates to this kind of complete disenfranchisement. But you have more power than you realize. This is still your house, and what they've done may constitute several crimes." Crimes. The word felt foreign but fitting. What they had done to me, to Frank's memory, to our home, was more than betrayal. It was theft on a scale I was only beginning to understand. Mary scheduled an appointment for that afternoon. I spent the morning documenting everything I could remember about the destroyed photographs, the missing furniture, the altered rooms. I made a list of every item I could identify that had been removed or replaced without my knowledge or consent. The list filled 12 pages. But more importantly, I made a decision about what kind of woman I wanted to be for whatever years I had left. Not the accommodating mother who swallowed hurt to keep peace. Not the grateful grandmother who accepted crumbs of attention like feast portions. Not the convenient victim who made everyone feel better about their casual cruelties by forgiving them quickly and completely. I decided to be the woman Frank had married, the one who knew her worth and demanded it be recognized. The appointment with Mary Morrison changed everything. She explained that the credit card fraud was just the beginning. Using my utilities and address to establish credit, forging my signature on various documents, making substantial alterations to my property without consent, accessing my personal belongings and destroying them, all of it added up to a pattern of exploitation that could result in serious legal consequences. But Mrs. Kowalski, she warned me, if you choose to pursue this legally, you need to be prepared for your family to fight back. They'll try to portray you as confused, incompetent, maybe even dangerous to yourself. They'll claim they were protecting you, helping you, acting in your best interests. Are you prepared for that kind of battle? I thought about Frank's ashes on a basement shelf between paint cans and lawn fertilizer. I thought about my mother's china sold for pocket change to strangers. I thought about my wedding photographs torn in half and thrown away like garbage. I'm prepared, I told her. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cooked dinner for myself in my alien kitchen, using ingredients I actually wanted to eat instead of whatever was cheapest or most practical. I opened a bottle of good wine, the kind Frank and I used to save for special occasions that seemed to come less and less frequently as we grew older. I set the table with the few pieces of silverware that had survived the purge and ate slowly, savoring both the food and the silence. For the first time in months, the silence felt like peace instead of punishment. Then I called Michael. Mom. His voice carried the bright, false cheerfulness I had learned to recognize as guilt wearing a disguise. How are you settling back in? Is everything okay with the house? We need to talk, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. All of us. You, Diane, Sarah, David. This weekend. Talk? About what? Mom, you sound upset. Are you feeling all right? There it was, the first suggestion that my distress was a symptom rather than a response. The foundation they were already laying for the incompetence narrative Mary had warned me about. I'm feeling clearer than I have in years, I told him. Saturday at 2 o'clock. Here. Don't bring the grandchildren. I hung up before he could respond, before the familiar pattern of excuse-making and blame-shifting and problem-minimizing could begin. For the first time in our relationship, I had ended a conversation on my terms instead of allowing it to drag on until I felt small enough to apologize for bothering him. The rest of the week passed like the calm before a storm I was choosing to summon. I spent the days reclaiming my space, moving Frank's urn back to the mantelpiece where it belonged, shopping for food I wanted to eat and flowers I wanted to see. I bought new sheets for my bed, soft ones in colors that made me smile instead of the institutional white someone else had chosen for me. Most importantly, I went through the house with a fine-toothed comb and documented every single change, every missing item, every violation of the home Frank and I had built together. By Friday evening, I had a folder 3 inches thick with photographs, receipts, and written descriptions of what had been taken from me. Saturday came too quickly and not quickly enough. They arrived together, a united front of concerned family members coming to check on poor, confused Mom who was clearly having some kind of episode. Michael looked uncomfortable but determined. Diane wore her most patient smile, the one she usually reserved for his mother's most unreasonable requests. Sarah seemed genuinely puzzled, and David looked like he wished he was anywhere else. We sat in my transformed living room, the space where I had once hosted birthday parties and holiday celebrations and quiet evenings of television and conversation. Now it felt like a conference room, sterile and impersonal, designed for business rather than belonging. I had prepared for this moment, but nothing could have prepared me for the casual cruelty of their explanations. Mom, we were trying to help, Diane began, her voice carrying the patient tone usually reserved for small children and confused elderly people. The house was getting too much for you to maintain. It was becoming a safety hazard. A safety hazard. My home of 50 years, where I had raised 3 children and buried 1 husband and hosted countless celebrations and weathered every kind of storm that life could bring, was being described like a condemned building. We were going to surprise you when you were ready, Michael added, not quite meeting my eyes. Show you how beautiful the house could look for potential buyers. We thought you'd be proud of how much we could get for it. Potential buyers. They were discussing the sale of my home as if it were already decided, as if I were already dead, as if my opinions were irrelevant to decisions about my own life. Sarah, who had been quiet until now, finally spoke up. Mom, you've been struggling. We could all see it. Living alone at your age, in a house this size, it's not practical anymore. We found some beautiful senior communities where you'd have friends, activities, people to look after you. People to look after me. As if the people who were supposed to be looking after me hadn't just spent 6 weeks systematically dismantling my existence. David, my baby, the quiet one who had always tried to stay out of family conflicts, cleared his throat. We just want what's best for you, Mom. The house is worth a lot of money now. You could have a really comfortable retirement if we sold it. A really comfortable retirement. In other words, if I gave up my home, my independence, my right to make decisions about my own life, I could purchase the privilege of being warehoused with other inconvenient elderly people until I died. I listened to all of it without interrupting, watching their faces as they spoke, noting how none of them could maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds. These were the children I had loved and sacrificed for and believed in, and they were sitting in my living room explaining to me why erasing my existence was actually a gift. When they finished their carefully rehearsed explanations, I opened the folder I had prepared and began reading. Frank's antique desk, sold to an estate buyer for $300. Actual value according to my insurance appraisal from 2018, $1,500. My mother's china cabinet, sold to another dealer for $250. Actual value, over $2,000. The dining room set where we celebrated every holiday for 40 years, donated to Goodwill for a tax write-off despite being worth more than $5,000. I continued reading for 10 minutes, documenting the systematic destruction of 50 years of my life while they sat in increasingly uncomfortable silence. When I finished with the property liquidation, I moved on to the financial exploitation. Unauthorized charges on my Visa card totaling $8,437. Forged signatures on utility transfers, bank documents, and what appears to be a preliminary contract with a real estate agent I never met. Diane's patient smile had disappeared entirely. Michael was staring at his hands. Sarah looked shocked, as if she was hearing about these violations for the first time. David had gone pale. But most importantly, I continued, my voice steady despite the earthquake of emotions inside my chest. Sometime during the orchestrated destruction of my home, someone moved my husband's ashes to the basement and stored them between paint cans and gardening supplies. Frank, who worked 2 jobs for 15 years to help pay for this house, who spent his last healthy days in these rooms, who asked me to scatter his ashes in our garden when I felt ready, was relocated to make my living room more appealing to buyers. That's when Diane made her crucial mistake. Instead of apologizing, instead of expressing remorse, instead of acknowledging the devastating cruelty of what they had done, she laughed. Not a nervous laugh or an uncomfortable giggle, but a sharp, dismissive sound that cut through the room like a blade through silk. Really, Mom? You're going to turn this into some kind of drama about Dad's ashes? He's dead. It's just dust in a jar. What matters is making sure you're taken care of while you're still alive. The room went absolutely silent. Even Michael, who had been married to this woman for 15 years, looked stunned by the casual brutality of her words. Sarah gasped audibly. David actually stood up and took a step away from his sister-in-law, as if her callousness might be contagious. But I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Not hurt, not confusion, not the familiar urge to apologize for causing conflict. I felt powerful. Get out, I said quietly. Mom, let's not, Michael started. Get out of my house, I repeated, my voice growing stronger. All of you except David and Sarah. Get out now. Diane's face flushed red. You're being ridiculous. We're trying to help you, and this is how you respond? With paranoid accusations and melodrama? I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece where Frank's urn had been returned to its proper place of honor. Beside it was the folder Mary Morrison had helped me prepare, containing documentation of every crime that had been committed against me, every violation of trust, every theft of property and dignity. I said get out, I repeated. And if you're not gone in the next 60 seconds, I'm calling the police to report the credit card fraud, the forgery, the destruction of my personal property, and the theft of items worth more than $20,000. Michael looked like I had slapped him. Mom, you wouldn't actually try me. For the first time in decades, my son saw me as I really was instead of as the convenient, compliant woman I had trained myself to become. He saw the strength that had raised 3 children mostly alone while Frank worked double shifts. He saw the determination that had held our family together through job losses and illnesses and every kind of crisis that life could deliver. He saw the woman who had loved him unconditionally but would no longer allow that love to be weaponized against her. He and Diane left without another word, her heels clicking angrily against the hardwood floors Frank had refinished by hand 30 years ago, him trailing behind her like a child being dragged away from a playground. When the door closed behind them, Sarah and David both started talking at once, their voices overlapping with apologies and explanations and desperate attempts to distance themselves from what their brother and sister-in-law had done. Mom, I had no idea. If we had known what they were planning, this isn't what any of us wanted. I held up my hand and they stopped talking immediately, both of them looking at me with expressions I hadn't seen since they were teenagers testing boundaries and discovering consequences. I need you to understand something, I told them. This isn't just about Michael and Diane. This is about a family that watched me disappear for years without saying anything. This is about everyone who accepted the story that I was becoming a burden instead of recognizing that I was being treated like one. Sarah started crying, but they weren't manipulative tears meant to deflect responsibility. They were the genuine tears of a daughter realizing she had failed her mother in fundamental ways. We should have seen it, she whispered. We should have done something. Yes, I agreed. You should have. But you can start now. Over the next hour, I explained to them what I had learned from Mary Morrison about elder exploitation, what I had documented about the systematic destruction of my life, and what I intended to do about it. They listened without interrupting, without making excuses, without trying to minimize what had happened or suggest that everyone had good intentions. When I finished, David asked the question I had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "What do you want from us, Mom? How do we make this right?" I looked around my violated living room, at the sterile white walls and the impersonal furniture and the complete absence of any evidence that Frank and I had lived and loved in these rooms for half a century. "I want my home back," I said. "I want the photographs replaced, the furniture returned or equivalent pieces found, the walls painted back to colors that feel like home instead of a hospital. I want Frank's desk back from whoever bought it. I want Mom's china cabinet located and purchased back regardless of the cost." They nodded, tears flowing freely now, finally understanding the magnitude of what had been taken from me. "And I want you to understand that this is the last time I will accept being treated like a problem to be solved instead of a person to be loved," I continued. "If you want a relationship with me going forward, it will be on terms of mutual respect, not out of duty or guilt or convenience." Sarah and David spent the rest of the afternoon helping me document what needed to be replaced or restored. They took photographs, made lists, and called friends who might know where to find antique dealers who could help locate the stolen pieces of my history. They worked quickly but carefully, treating each missing item like the precious memory it represented. As the sun began to set, painting my white walls with warm golden light that reminded me why I had once loved this room, Sarah asked me one more question. "Mom, can I ask you something? Why didn't you fight back sooner? You're so strong now, but you seemed so defeated before. What changed?" I thought about that question for a long time, watching the light fade to dusk while I searched for an honest answer. "I forgot who I was," I finally said. "I spent so many years taking care of everyone else that I forgot I deserved to be taken care of too. I accepted being treated badly because I thought that was the price of being loved. But when I saw Frank's ashes in that basement, when I realized they were willing to dishonor even his memory to get what they wanted, something broke open in me that had been locked away for a very long time." David hugged me then, really hugged me, not the obligatory embrace of a son fulfilling his duty but the fierce grip of a child who had rediscovered his mother and was afraid of losing her again. "We won't let this happen again," he promised. Never again. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because my problems were solved, but because I had finally stopped trying to solve them by making myself smaller. For the first time in years, I took up all the space I was entitled to in my own bed, in my own house, in my own life. The war, however, was just beginning. The next morning brought a phone call that made me grateful I had spent the weekend remembering how to fight. "Mrs. Kowalski, this is Dr. Henderson from Chicago General Hospital. I'm calling because your son Michael has requested that we evaluate your mental competency. He's expressed concerns about your ability to make sound decisions regarding your living situation and finances." My blood turned to ice water. This was exactly what Mary Morrison had warned me about, the nuclear option that families often employed when elderly relatives refused to cooperate with their plans. If Michael could convince a doctor that I was suffering from dementia or some other cognitive impairment, he could petition the court for guardianship, effectively making me a legal child under his control. "I see," I said, proud of how steady my voice remained despite the terror clawing at my throat. "And what exactly did my son tell you about my mental state?" "He mentioned that you've become paranoid and suspicious, that you're making wild accusations against family members who are trying to help you, that you're living in unsafe conditions and making poor financial decisions. He's requesting an emergency evaluation." Wild accusations. Poor financial decisions. The gaslighting was beginning exactly as predicted, the systematic portrayal of my legitimate grievances as symptoms of mental illness. "Doctor, I appreciate your concern, but I should inform you that my mental competency was evaluated just last month by Dr. Sarah Chen as part of a legal consultation. I'm completely capable of making my own decisions, and what my son is describing as paranoid delusions are actually documented instances of financial fraud and property theft that I'm pursuing through legal channels." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I see. Well, if you have recent documentation of cognitive testing, that does change things. Perhaps we could schedule a voluntary consultation instead of an emergency evaluation." I agreed to the voluntary consultation, knowing that refusing would only strengthen their case that I was unstable and uncooperative. But I also called Mary Morrison immediately after hanging up to let her know what was happening. "This is escalating quickly," she warned me. "They're moving to discredit you before you can pursue criminal charges. We need to accelerate our timeline." That afternoon, Mary and I filed a formal police report documenting the credit card fraud, the forged signatures, and the destruction of personal property. We also filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for the stolen and destroyed items, plus additional compensation for emotional distress and violation of my civil rights as an elderly person. But most importantly, we filed for a restraining order preventing Michael and Diane from accessing my property, my financial accounts, or my medical information without my expressed written consent. The restraining order was served on Tuesday. Michael called me that evening, his voice shaking with what sounded like genuine distress. "Mom, what are you doing? This is insane. We're family. You can't take out a restraining order against your own son." "I can and I have," I told him. "You and your wife committed crimes against me. You violated my trust, stole my property, destroyed my memories, and then tried to have me declared mentally incompetent when I refused to cooperate with your plans to warehouse me in a nursing home. What exactly did you think would happen? We were trying to protect you. The house is too big, you're too isolated, you're making mistakes." "The only mistake I made was trusting you," I interrupted. "The only mistake I made was believing that my love would be enough to guarantee decent treatment from my own children." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. When Michael spoke again, his voice was softer, more like the little boy who used to crawl into my lap when thunderstorms scared him. "Mom, I never meant for things to go this far. Diane, she has strong opinions about what's best for everyone. But I love you. I would never want to hurt you." For a moment, I felt the familiar tug of maternal instinct, the overwhelming urge to comfort my child and absorb his pain and make everything better regardless of the cost to myself. This was the trap that had caught me for decades, the belief that loving someone meant accepting any treatment they chose to give me. But then I remembered Frank's ashes on that basement shelf, and the trap lost its power. "Michael," I said, "I raised you to be a good man. I taught you right from wrong. I modeled kindness and sacrifice and unconditional love. If you chose to watch your wife systematically destroy your mother's life without intervening, if you participated in trying to have me declared incompetent for refusing to be victimized, then you made those choices as an adult with full knowledge of what you were doing. But she's my wife, Mom. I can't just, she was committing crimes against your mother," I said. "And you chose her over me. Now you get to live with that choice." I hung up before he could respond, before the conversation could devolve into the familiar pattern of excuse-making and blame-shifting that had characterized our relationship for years. The next few weeks were brutal. The restraining order didn't prevent Michael and Diane from waging a campaign of character assassination through other family members, family friends, and anyone else who would listen to their version of events. According to them, I had become a paranoid, vindictive old woman who was tearing the family apart with baseless accusations and legal dramatics. Some people believed them. Cousins who had known me for decades started treating me with the careful concern usually reserved for mental patients. Church friends began making comments about how difficult aging could be, how families sometimes had to make hard decisions about elderly relatives who could no longer care for themselves properly. But others saw through the manipulation. Mrs. Patterson became my unofficial bodyguard, coming over every few days to check on me and accompanying me to appointments when I needed moral support. My friend Eleanor from book club, who had watched her own daughter try to manipulate her into selling her home, recognized the pattern immediately and became a fierce ally. Most surprisingly, my granddaughter Lily, Michael's middle child, showed up at my door one afternoon after school with tears in her eyes and a fierce expression that reminded me of myself at her age. "Grandma Rose," she said, "I need you to know that I don't believe what Dad and Mom are saying about you. And I need you to know that I'm not okay with what they did to your house." Lily was 16, old enough to understand the situation and young enough to still believe in justice. She had been present during some of the renovation weeks and had questioned why they were throwing away so many of her grandmother's things. "Mom said you were moving to a nice place where you'd be happier and wouldn't need all that old stuff anymore," Lily told me. "But when I asked if I could keep some of it, like Grandpa's books or your photo albums, she said everything had to go because it would just make you sad to be reminded of the past." Everything had to go. Even my granddaughter wasn't allowed to preserve pieces of my history because they might inconvenience the narrative that I was better off without my memories. "Grandma, I tried to save some things," Lily continued, pulling a small box from her backpack. "I hid them in my room before the donation truck came. Inside the box were treasures I thought had been lost forever. The wooden jewelry box Frank had made me for our first anniversary. A handful of photographs they had missed during their purge, including one of Lily as a toddler sitting on my lap in the garden Frank and I had planted together. A few pieces of my mother's jewelry that had somehow escaped the great liquidation. But most precious of all was a letter Frank had written me on our 30th anniversary, one I thought had been destroyed along with everything else. Lily had found it tucked inside one of his books and had recognized my name on the envelope. I opened it with shaking hands and read words I hadn't seen in 5 years, words Frank had written to celebrate 3 decades of marriage and to promise 3 decades more. "My dearest Rose," the letter began, "30 years ago today I married the strongest woman I'd ever met, and every day since then you've proven me right. You've raised our children with wisdom and patience I couldn't have imagined. You've made our house into a home that's been shelter and sanctuary for everyone lucky enough to enter it. You've loved me through my worst mistakes and celebrated my smallest victories. If I live 30 more years, I hope to spend them proving that I deserve the blessing of being your husband." By the time I finished reading, both Lily and I were crying. But they weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were tears of recognition, of remembering who I had been before I allowed myself to be diminished, of understanding that the woman Frank had loved and admired was still here, still strong, still deserving of respect and dignity. "Grandma," Lily said, "I want you to know that not all of us forgot who you are. And I want you to know that if you need someone on your side, I'm here." That conversation with Lily marked a turning point in my recovery. Not just because she had saved precious pieces of my history, but because she had reminded me that I was worth saving. Her 16-year-old heart had recognized injustice that the adults in our family had been willing to rationalize or ignore. The legal proceedings moved slowly but steadily in my favor. The credit card fraud was relatively easy to prove, especially since Diane had been careless about covering her tracks. The destruction of property was more complicated but well documented thanks to Mrs. Patterson's detailed observations and the careful records I had kept. But the real victory wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the gradual restoration of my home and my sense of self. Sarah and David kept their promises about helping me recover what had been stolen. It took months and cost more than I wanted to spend, but we managed to locate and repurchase many of the items that had been sold without my consent. Frank's desk came back for triple what the estate buyer had paid for it, but seeing it in its proper place in our bedroom was worth any amount of money. The china cabinet was more difficult. The antique dealer who had bought it had already sold it to a collector in Milwaukee, who was understandably reluctant to give up a piece she had purchased legitimately. But when Sarah explained the situation, the woman agreed to sell it back at cost, saying she couldn't enjoy something that had been obtained through elder abuse. Piece by piece, room by room, my home began to feel like home again. Not exactly as it had been before, because some things were lost forever and others now carried the weight of betrayal that couldn't be entirely erased. But it became a space that honored my history instead of erasing it, a place where Frank's memory was welcomed instead of hidden away. The most significant change wasn't in the furniture or the photographs or the paint colors, though. It was in me. I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and elder abuse. Dr. Williams helped me understand that what had happened to me was part of a pattern of exploitation that often goes unrecognized because it's wrapped in the language of care and concern. Abusers often convince their victims that the abuse is actually love, she explained during one of our early sessions. They frame their control as protection, their theft as management, their violation as help. It's particularly effective with elderly victims because we're socialized to believe that accepting help gracefully is a virtue, even when that help comes at the cost of our dignity and autonomy. Through therapy, I began to understand how I had been groomed for this abuse over many years. Every time I had swallowed my hurt to keep peace, every time I had excused their selfishness as busy schedules, every time I had accepted less than I deserved and been grateful for it, I had been training them to see me as someone who could be treated badly without consequence. "You taught them that your pain didn't matter," Dr. Williams said gently. "Not because you wanted to, but because you believed that preserving the relationship was more important than preserving yourself. Many women of your generation were raised to believe that self-sacrifice was the highest form of love. But she also helped me see that recognizing my role in enabling the abuse didn't make me responsible for it. Michael and Diane had made conscious choices to exploit my generosity and violate my trust. They had decided that their convenience mattered more than my humanity. Those were their choices, not mine. The hardest part of recovery was learning to live with the reality that some relationships couldn't be repaired, not because I was unwilling to forgive, but because forgiveness without accountability is just enabling. Michael made several attempts to reconcile during the months following the restraining order. Phone calls where he apologized for how things had gotten out of hand, but insisted that their intentions had been good. Letters where he blamed Diane's strong personality for pushing him into decisions he now regretted. Flowers delivered on Mother's Day with cards expressing love and regret but no acknowledgement of the crimes that had been committed or the trust that had been violated. Each attempt at reconciliation followed the same pattern: vague apologies that avoided specifics, promises to do better without acknowledgement of what exactly needed to be improved, and subtle pressure for me to put this behind us and focus on healing the family. But there was never accountability. Never a detailed confession of what they had done wrong. Never an offer to make complete financial restitution. Never a recognition that they had committed crimes against me that had legal and moral consequences that couldn't be erased with flowers and greeting card sentiments. During one of his surprise visits, which violated the spirit if not the letter of the restraining order, Michael sat in my living room and made one last desperate attempt to restore our relationship to its previous dynamic. "Mom, I miss you," he said, and the pain in his voice was genuine. I miss our Sunday calls and having you at family dinners and knowing you're there when we need you. This legal stuff and all these lawyers and accusations, it's tearing our family apart. Can't we just go back to the way things were? The way things were. He was asking me to return to being the convenient, compliant woman who absorbed hurt without complaint, who gave without receiving, who accepted whatever treatment they chose to offer and was grateful for it. Michael, I said, looking at my middle child, my gentle boy who had somehow grown into a man who could participate in systematically destroying his mother's life and then ask her to pretend it never happened, the way things were was killing me. That was the end of our relationship as mother and son. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I finally loved myself enough to refuse to be destroyed by that love. The legal case concluded 9 months after I filed charges. Diane pleaded guilty to credit card fraud and received 2 years probation plus restitution for the money she had stolen. The civil suit was settled out of court for an amount that covered the replacement costs of my destroyed property plus compensation for emotional distress. But more importantly, the case established a legal record of what had happened to me, documentation that would prevent any future attempts to portray me as a confused old woman making false accusations. Michael and Diane divorced 6 months later. I heard about it through Sarah, who had maintained a careful relationship with her brother while making it clear that she wouldn't tolerate any criticism of my decision to pursue legal action. He says Diane manipulated him into the worst decisions, Sarah told me during one of our weekly coffee visits. He claims he never wanted to hurt you and that she convinced him that everything they were doing was necessary to protect you. Maybe that was true. Maybe Michael had been a weak man manipulated by a controlling wife rather than a willing participant in elder abuse. But the result had been the same either way, and I was no longer interested in accepting explanations that absolved people of responsibility for their choices. The divorce was apparently bitter and expensive. Diane fought for half of everything, including half the value of property she claimed they had jointly invested in improving. She was referring to the renovations done to my house, improvements she argued had increased its value and should be considered marital assets. The irony was stunning. She had destroyed my home without permission, then tried to claim ownership of the destruction during her divorce proceedings. Michael called me during the worst of the divorce proceedings, desperate and broken, asking if I would testify on his behalf about Diane's manipulative behavior and her role in orchestrating the abuse I had suffered. I listened to his request with the detached interest of someone observing a car accident from a safe distance. "You want me to help you," I said when he finished explaining what he needed from me. "Mom, please. I know I hurt you, but she was the one who planned everything. She was the one who insisted we had to act quickly before you changed your mind about moving. She was the one who said your stuff was just junk that was making you hold on to the past. If you could just tell the court what she was really like, it would help me keep the house, keep custody of the kids." The house he was fighting to keep was the one he had purchased with money that should have been my retirement fund. The custody he was worried about was for children he had raised to treat their grandmother as a burden rather than a blessing. He was asking the woman he had tried to have declared mentally incompetent to save him from the consequences of his own choices. "No," I said. "Mom, please. I'm your son. I made mistakes, but I'm still your son." "Yes," I agreed. "You are my son. And that makes what you did to me even worse, not better. You're not my responsibility anymore, Michael. Your problems with Diane are between the two of you. Leave me out of it." That was the last conversation we had. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because I had finally learned the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation, between loving someone and allowing them to continue hurting me. I forgave Michael because carrying anger was poisoning me more than it was affecting him. But forgiveness didn't mean pretending that his actions hadn't revealed fundamental character flaws that made a healthy relationship impossible. It didn't mean opening myself up to future betrayal. It didn't mean accepting responsibility for fixing problems I hadn't created. Forgiveness, I learned, was something I could do for my own peace without requiring anything from him in return. But reconciliation required accountability, genuine change, and a proven track record of different behavior over time. None of those things were offered or demonstrated. So I chose peace over proximity, self-protection over family harmony, my own well-being over the comfort of pretending that love was enough to overcome any betrayal. The transformation wasn't just psychological. It was practical, social, and financial too. With the settlement money and the restitution I received, I was able to make improvements to my home that I had been deferring for years. New windows, updated plumbing, a renovated bathroom that was safe for aging in place. But these were improvements I chose, modifications that honored the history of the house while making it more comfortable for the next phase of my life. I also started volunteering with the Chicago Department on Aging, helping other seniors recognize and report elder abuse. The work was heartbreaking and empowering in equal measure. Heartbreaking because I met so many people whose stories mirrored or exceeded my own experiences of exploitation and neglect. Empowering because I could offer them something precious, proof that it was possible to fight back and survive and create a better life even after devastating betrayal. Mrs. Kowalski, one woman said to me after I helped her navigate the legal process of recovering money her grandson had stolen from her account, "You saved my life. Not just my money, but my life. I thought I was going crazy. I thought I deserved what was happening to me. You showed me that I still matter." That work led to friendships with other women who had survived various forms of family exploitation. We formed an informal support group that met monthly at a community center, sharing strategies for protecting ourselves, celebrating victories both large and small, and simply bearing witness to each other's experiences. For the first time in years, I was part of a community where I was valued for who I was rather than tolerated for what I could provide. These women understood the specific pain of being betrayed by people you had loved unconditionally. They understood the guilt that came with setting boundaries with family members. They understood the fear of dying alone that made so many of us accept terrible treatment rather than risk complete isolation. But they also understood the fierce joy of reclaiming your life, the satisfaction of choosing dignity over appeasement, the unexpected strength that emerged from refusing to be anyone's convenient victim. My social life expanded beyond the support group too. I reconnected with friends I had neglected during the years when managing family crises had consumed all my emotional energy. I made new friends through volunteer work and the photography classes I had started taking at the community college. Photography became my unexpected passion during this period of rebirth. There was something healing about learning to see beauty through a lens, about capturing moments of light and shadow and preserving them by choice rather than having them stolen or destroyed by others. I documented my neighborhood with fresh eyes, taking pictures of the houses where families were growing up, of the elderly couples walking together in small parks, of the immigrant shopkeepers who had built businesses and raised children in the same area where I had raised mine. The camera taught me to look for details I had been missing, to appreciate the present moment instead of living in anxiety about an uncontrollable future. My instructor, a woman in her 70s named Margaret who had taken up photography after her husband died, became a particularly close friend. She understood the challenge of building a new identity after spending decades defining yourself primarily through relationships with other people. The beautiful thing about starting over later in life, she told me during one of our photo walks through Lincoln Park, is that you get to choose who you want to be based on what you've learned rather than who you think you should be based on what others expect. That wisdom resonated deeply. I had spent most of my adult life trying to be the mother, wife, and grandmother that I thought my family needed, even when that meant denying my own needs and accepting treatment that diminished me. Now I was free to discover who Rose Kowalski was when she wasn't trying to earn love through sacrifice. I discovered that I was braver than I had known. Strong enough to fight legal battles against people I loved. Resilient enough to rebuild a life that had been systematically dismantled. Independent enough to create happiness that didn't depend on other people's approval or inclusion. I discovered that I was more social than I had believed. During my years of family-focused isolation, I had convinced myself that I was naturally solitary, that I preferred quiet evenings at home to social activities. But when I started saying yes to invitations from new friends, when I began hosting small dinner parties and book club meetings, I realized that I had been starving for genuine connection and intellectual stimulation. Most importantly, I discovered that I was worthy of respect and kindness not because of what I could do for others, but simply because of my inherent value as a human being. This sounds like such a basic concept, but for someone who had spent decades earning love through service, it was a revolutionary realization. The relationship with Lily, my granddaughter, continued to develop during this period of reconstruction. She was away at college now, studying social work with a specialization in elder advocacy. She credited our experience with inspiring her career choice. "Grandma Rose," she told me during one of her visits home, "seeing what happened to you and watching how you fought back taught me that there are a lot of people who need someone on their side. I want to be that person for other families." Lily still maintained relationships with both of her parents, but she had made it clear that any criticism of me or attempt to use her as a go-between would result in her immediately ending the conversation. She had grown into a young woman with clear boundaries and strong values, someone who understood that love didn't require accepting abuse. During her junior year, she asked if she could interview me for a research project about elder abuse and family exploitation. The interview was difficult but healing, an opportunity to tell my story in detail to someone who understood its broader significance. "Grandma, do you ever regret fighting back?" she asked me. "Do you ever wish you had just accepted their help and moved to one of those senior communities they had picked out?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "Lily, there are moments when I miss the illusion of family harmony. There are days when I feel incredibly sad that my relationship with your father ended the way it did. There are times when I wonder what would have happened if I had been willing to accept their version of care, even though it meant giving up my independence and dignity. I paused, looking around my living room, which had been carefully restored to reflect my taste and history rather than someone else's idea of what my life should look like. But regret fighting back? Never. Because fighting back wasn't about punishing them or getting revenge. It was about saving myself. It was about refusing to disappear quietly. It was about honoring the woman your grandfather fell in love with and the mother who raised 3 children and the person who deserved better treatment than she was receiving. That conversation with Lily became part of her final project, which won an award at the state level and was later published in a journal about social work and elder advocacy. Seeing my story used to educate people who would be working with vulnerable elderly populations felt like a meaningful way to transform my pain into something useful. But the most healing aspect of my new life wasn't the volunteer work or the legal victory or the friendships or even the improved relationship with my surviving children who had chosen accountability over denial. It was the quiet satisfaction of waking up each morning in a home that felt like home, of making decisions based on my own preferences and values, of no longer having to earn the right to exist in my own space. 3 years after that devastating February morning when I discovered what had been done to my home, I was sitting in my garden on a perfect spring evening, watching purple crocuses push through soil that had been left fallow too long. The garden that had been destroyed during the renovation had been replanted, not exactly as it was before, but as something new that honored both the past and the possibilities ahead. Frank's roses were blooming again. I had found a nursery that specialized in heritage varieties and had managed to locate the exact cultivars we had planted together 40 years earlier. They weren't the same plants, but they carried the same genetic memory, the same potential for beauty, the same promise that careful tending could create something lovely and lasting. I was holding a glass of wine, something I had rediscovered after years of believing that drinking alone was somehow shameful or dangerous. Now I understood that sharing a glass of wine with yourself could be an act of self-care rather than self-destruction, especially when accompanied by a good book and the sound of evening birds settling in for the night. The photo album Lily had saved was open on the small table beside my chair, and I was looking through pictures from happier times, before the family relationships had become complicated by exploitation and manipulation. There was Frank at 40, grinning as he held up a fish he'd caught during our vacation to Wisconsin. There were my children as teenagers, rolling their eyes at my insistence that they pose for formal portraits each Christmas. There was my mother visiting from Pittsburgh, teaching her granddaughters to make pierogi in our kitchen. Looking at those photographs no longer brought pain. Instead, they reminded me of love that had been real, happiness that had been genuine, family connections that had once been based on mutual affection rather than one-sided obligation. The fact that some of those relationships had deteriorated didn't negate the reality of the good years that had preceded the bad ones. I had learned the difference between honoring the past and being imprisoned by it, between cherishing memories and allowing them to prevent growth, between loving people and accepting whatever treatment they chose to give me in the name of that love. As the sun began to set, painting my garden in the golden light that photographers call magic hour, I reflected on the woman I had become through this process of destruction and reconstruction. I was no longer the people-pleasing grandmother who absorbed hurt without complaint. But I also wasn't a bitter old woman consumed by anger and resentment. I had found a middle path, a way to be strong without being harsh, protective without being paranoid, independent without being isolated. I had learned that setting boundaries was an act of love, not selfishness. That saying no to treatment that diminished me was actually saying yes to relationships that could grow and thrive based on mutual respect rather than uneven power dynamics. Most importantly, I had learned that it's never too late to save yourself, never too late to demand better, never too late to choose dignity over harmony, self-respect over family peace, authentic connection over superficial inclusion. The phone rang as I was finishing my wine and preparing to go inside for the evening. The caller ID showed Sarah's number, and I answered with genuine pleasure rather than the anxious dread that family phone calls had once triggered. "Hi Mom, how are you doing?" she asked, her voice warm and unforced. "I'm wonderful," I replied, and realized I meant it completely. Not wonderful considering my age, not wonderful despite my circumstances, but simply, genuinely wonderful. We talked for nearly an hour, about her work and her children and the photography exhibition I was participating in at the community center. She asked thoughtful questions about my classes and my volunteer work and seemed genuinely interested in the life I was building for myself rather than worried about whether that life was causing inconvenience for other family members. Before hanging up, Sarah said something that surprised me. "Mom, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. For fighting back, for standing up for yourself, for building this amazing life. You've become such an inspiration to me and my daughters. We all want to be as brave as you are when we face difficult situations." After we said goodbye, I sat in my garden for a few more minutes, thinking about that word, brave. For most of my life, bravery had meant enduring pain quietly, sacrificing my own needs for others, putting family harmony above my own well-being. I had thought that complaining about mistreatment was cowardly, that demanding respect was selfish, that protecting myself was giving up on love. But real bravery, I had learned, was refusing to disappear quietly. It was demanding to be seen and heard and valued. It was fighting for your right to exist safely and with dignity in your own space and in your own family. It was choosing the difficult path of confrontation and accountability over the familiar path of accommodation and resentment. Real bravery was looking at a life that wasn't working and having the courage to change it, even when that change meant losing people you loved, even when it meant facing the unknown alone, even when it meant admitting that sacrifice hadn't been enough to guarantee love. As I locked my front door and turned off the porch light, I thought about all the women who might be listening to my story, women who were trapped in family dynamics that were slowly erasing them, women who were accepting terrible treatment because they feared loneliness more than they valued dignity. I wanted them to know what I had learned through my own painful journey, that loneliness shared is actually solitude, and solitude can be peaceful in ways that toxic connection never can be. That respect earned through fear is just compliance, while respect based on genuine appreciation feeds the soul. That family is supposed to be a source of support and love, not a burden that grows heavier with each passing year. Most importantly, I wanted them to know that it's never too late to save yourself. Never too late to say no to treatment that diminishes you. Never too late to discover who you really are when you're not trying to earn love through endless sacrifice. The woman who climbed the stairs to her bedroom that night was not the same woman who had stood in this house 3 years earlier, devastated by the discovery that her own family had systematically erased her existence. That woman had been broken but not defeated, hurt but not destroyed. She had used her pain as fuel for transformation rather than evidence of her worthlessness. She had learned that being elderly didn't mean accepting abuse, that being dependent on family for some things didn't mean surrendering all autonomy, that loving people unconditionally didn't mean accepting any treatment they chose to give. She had learned that her worth wasn't determined by her usefulness to others, that her value wasn't dependent on her ability to solve other people's problems or absorb their emotional cruelty without complaint. She had learned that true love enhances both people in the relationship, while exploitation diminishes one person for the benefit of another. That healthy families want their elderly members to thrive, not just survive. That genuine care seeks to preserve dignity, not strip it away in the name of efficiency or convenience. As I prepared for bed in my own space, surrounded by belongings I had chosen to keep and arranged the way I wanted them, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this place of peace and self-determination. The gratitude wasn't for the abuse I had suffered, but for the strength I had discovered in response to it. Not for the betrayal I had experienced, but for the clarity it had provided about which relationships were worth preserving and which ones were slowly killing me. Not for the pain itself, but for my refusal to accept pain as my permanent condition. I was grateful for the friends who had supported me through the legal battles and the emotional reconstruction. For the professionals who had helped me understand that exploitation wasn't love and that fighting back wasn't selfish. For the granddaughter who had saved precious pieces of my history when others were eager to throw it all away. But mostly, I was grateful for the woman I had become, someone who knew her worth and insisted that others recognize it too, someone who could distinguish between genuine care and manipulative control, someone who had learned that being alone was infinitely preferable to being with people who made her feel invisible. The last thing I did before turning off the bedside lamp was look at the photograph on my nightstand, Frank and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and completely unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. We looked so innocent, so confident that love would be enough to overcome any obstacle. In some ways, that confidence had been naive. Love alone hadn't been enough to protect me from exploitation by people I had raised and sacrificed for. Love alone hadn't prevented the destruction of the home we had built together. Love alone hadn't guaranteed that my final years would be peaceful and dignified. But love had been enough for something even more important. It had given me the foundation of self-worth that had made fighting back possible. Frank's love had taught me what respectful treatment looked like. His devotion had shown me that I was worthy of consideration and kindness. His memory had reminded me that I deserved better than what I was accepting from people who claimed to care about me. And my love for myself, hard-won after decades of putting everyone else first, had finally grown strong enough to demand that others treat me with the dignity I had learned to give myself. As sleep settled around me like a warm blanket, I thought about tomorrow and the day after that and all the days that stretched ahead. Not with anxiety about what others might expect from me or how I could make myself useful enough to earn inclusion, but with anticipation about what I might choose to do, what friendships I might deepen, what beauty I might capture through my camera lens, what other elderly people I might be able to help through my volunteer work. I thought about the garden that would continue to bloom each spring, about the books I wanted to read and the places I wanted to photograph and the quiet satisfaction of making decisions based on my own values rather than other people's convenience. For the first time in decades, my own life felt like something worth living rather than something to be endured. My own company felt like a gift rather than a punishment. My own home felt like sanctuary rather than a place where I was merely tolerated. I had learned that sometimes loving people means letting them go, especially when their presence in your life requires you to diminish yourself. That sometimes fighting is the most loving thing you can do, not just for yourself but for family members who need to learn that their actions have consequences. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to disappear quietly, even when disappearing would be easier for everyone else. That sometimes the greatest gift you can give your children and grandchildren is showing them what dignity looks like, what self-respect requires, what it means to value yourself enough to demand better treatment from the people who claim to love you. 6 months later, I received a letter that surprised me. It was from Michael, written in his own handwriting rather than typed on a computer, which immediately told me this was different from his previous attempts at reconciliation. Dear Mom, it began, I know you may not want to hear from me, and I understand if you choose not to respond to this letter. I'm writing because I've been in therapy for the past year, trying to understand how I became the kind of man who could participate in destroying his own mother's life and then blame her for being upset about it. The letter continued for several pages, detailing his growing understanding of how he had allowed Diane to manipulate him into betraying his own values, how his desire to avoid conflict had made him complicit in systematic abuse, how his fear of losing his marriage had caused him to sacrifice his relationship with his mother. But more importantly, the letter contained something none of his previous apologies had included: specific acknowledgement of what he had done wrong and genuine accountability for the choices he had made. I participated in stealing from you, lying to you, destroying your possessions, and violating your privacy and autonomy, he wrote. I allowed my wife to commit crimes against you and then helped her try to cover them up by portraying you as mentally incompetent. I chose her convenience over your dignity, her manipulation over your honesty, her version of events over the evidence of my own eyes. These were my choices, and I take full responsibility for them. The letter went on to express genuine remorse without making excuses, to acknowledge the damage that couldn't be repaired without minimizing its significance, to accept that forgiveness was something he hoped for but couldn't demand or expect. I don't know if you would ever be willing to see me again, he concluded, but if you are, I would like the chance to apologize in person. Not to ask for your forgiveness or to try to restore our previous relationship, but simply to look you in the eyes and acknowledge what I did to you. You deserved better from me, and I'm deeply sorry that it took losing you completely for me to understand that. I read the letter several times before deciding how to respond. The words felt genuine in a way his previous attempts at reconciliation had not. There was no blame shifting, no subtle manipulation, no attempt to minimize what had happened or rush past accountability toward premature forgiveness. But I also knew that words were easy and that genuine change required sustained effort over time. I had learned to be cautious about accepting apologies that weren't backed up by concrete action and behavioral change. After talking it through with Dr. Williams and several of my friends from the support group, I decided to respond with cautious openness. Not forgiveness, which would need to be earned through consistent respectful behavior over time, but willingness to have one carefully structured conversation. We met at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop near the community center where I did my volunteer work. I arrived early and chose a table where I felt safe and comfortable, where I could leave easily if the conversation became manipulative or abusive. Michael looked older than I expected, worn down in ways that went beyond simple aging. The confident, successful businessman I had raised had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely humbled by the consequences of his choices. He didn't try to hug me or act as if we were simply resuming a temporarily interrupted relationship. Instead, he sat across from me and began speaking in a voice that carried none of the defensive anger or manipulative charm I had learned to recognize. Mom, thank you for being willing to see me. I know I don't deserve this chance, and I want you to know that I'm not here to ask for anything from you. I'm here because you deserve to hear me take responsibility for what I did to you. For the next hour, he walked through every aspect of his participation in my exploitation, acknowledging specific actions and their impact without making excuses or shifting blame. He had clearly spent considerable time in therapy learning to recognize manipulation and accepting responsibility for his choices rather than portraying himself as another victim of Diane's behavior. I convinced myself that we were helping you, he said, but the truth is that we were helping ourselves at your expense and then gaslighting you into believing it was for your own good. That's not help. That's abuse disguised as care, and I was a willing participant in it. He talked about the marriage counseling that had led to his divorce, how his therapist had helped him understand that his pattern of avoiding conflict by sacrificing other people's well-being wasn't actually peacekeeping but cowardice. I threw you under the bus to avoid having difficult conversations with my wife, he admitted. I let her convince me that you were the problem instead of confronting her about her treatment of you. I chose what seemed like the easier path, even though it meant betraying the woman who had raised me to be better than that. But the most meaningful part of our conversation was when he talked about what he had learned from watching me fight back. Seeing you stand up for yourself, pursue legal action, refuse to accept our excuses and justifications, it was the first time I realized how strong you actually are and how much I had taken that strength for granted, he said. I had started thinking of you as this fragile old woman who needed to be managed and protected, but what you actually needed was to be respected and included and treated like the capable adult you've always been. He talked about the impact the divorce had had on his children, how they had struggled to understand why their family had fallen apart, how he had eventually been forced to tell them the truth about what he and their mother had done to their grandmother. Lily already knew most of it, he said. She had witnessed more than I realized, and she was old enough to recognize that what we were doing was wrong. But the younger kids were confused and angry, and they deserved an honest explanation rather than more lies and manipulation. That honesty had apparently been painful but healing for the family. The children were in therapy, learning to process the divorce and their parents' behavior, beginning to understand concepts like elder abuse and financial exploitation, grappling with the reality that people they loved had made horrible choices. They ask about you, Michael told me. They want to know if they'll ever be able to see you again, if you hate them because of what their parents did. That broke my heart. The younger grandchildren had been innocent bystanders to their parents' crimes, but they had suffered consequences nonetheless. They had lost access to their grandmother and watched their family implode, all because adults had prioritized convenience over conscience. I don't hate them, I told Michael. I don't hate you either. But I also can't pretend that what happened didn't happen, and I can't open myself up to being hurt like that again without genuine evidence that things would be different. We talked about what different might look like, what rebuilding trust would require, what boundaries would need to exist to protect everyone involved. Not the old boundaries that had protected Michael's comfort at the expense of my dignity, but new boundaries based on mutual respect and accountability. By the end of our conversation, I felt something I hadn't expected: hope. Not hope that our relationship could return to what it had been before, because that version of our relationship had been built on an unhealthy foundation of my self-sacrifice and his entitlement. But hope that we might be able to build something new and better, based on genuine respect and adult accountability. I agreed to occasional supervised visits with the grandchildren, structured interactions where they could begin to rebuild their relationship with me without being put in the middle of adult conflicts. I agreed to continue therapy both individually and potentially with Michael, to work through the damage that had been done and establish healthier patterns of interaction. But I was clear about what I wouldn't accept: any criticism of my decision to pursue legal action, any attempt to minimize what had happened, any suggestion that I should get over it for the sake of family harmony. I wouldn't accept being blamed for the family's problems or being asked to solve them through self-sacrifice. If you want a relationship with me, I told him, it has to be based on who I actually am, not who you think I should be. It has to respect my autonomy and my boundaries. It has to acknowledge that I'm an adult with the right to make my own decisions about my life, my home, and my relationships. Michael agreed to those terms, and over the past year, we've been slowly building something that resembles a healthy parent-adult-child relationship. It's not the same as what we had before, and it may never be as close as what we once shared. Too much damage was done for complete restoration. But it's built on a foundation of honesty rather than manipulation, respect rather than exploitation, accountability rather than denial. And that makes it more valuable than the previous relationship, even if it's more limited in scope. The process of rebuilding with Michael has taught me something important about forgiveness and reconciliation. I had always believed that forgiveness required returning to the previous state of the relationship, that love meant accepting people back into your life completely once they apologized. But I've learned that forgiveness can coexist with boundaries, that love can include limits, that redemption is possible without returning to patterns that were harmful to everyone involved. I've learned that it's possible to love someone while still protecting yourself from them, to hope for their growth while refusing to sacrifice your well-being to enable it, to forgive past hurt while maintaining vigilance about future behavior. Most importantly, I've learned that healing doesn't require pretending that damage wasn't done or that all relationships can be fully restored. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is build something new and different, something that honors both the love that exists and the reality of what happened. Today, as I sit in my garden on a beautiful autumn afternoon, I'm surrounded by evidence of transformation. The roses Frank and I planted are blooming again, fuller and more beautiful than ever. The vegetable garden has produced enough tomatoes and herbs to share with neighbors and friends. The fruit trees have grown tall and strong, providing shade and sustenance for the next generation. Like my garden, my life has been pruned and replanted and tended with care. Some things that were destroyed will never grow back, but new growth has taken their place. Some relationships were lost, but others have flourished in ways I never expected. I think about the woman I was 5 years ago, isolated and diminishing, accepting terrible treatment because she thought it was the price of belonging somewhere. That woman was already disappearing before anyone tried to erase her, slowly sacrificing pieces of herself until there was almost nothing left to save. But she had enough strength left to fight back when the alternative was complete obliteration. She had enough self-respect buried beneath years of conditioning to recognize when that respect was being violated. She had enough love for herself, hard-won and carefully guarded, to demand better treatment from the people who claimed to love her. That fight saved my life in every way that matters. Not just physically, though the stress of accepting abuse had been affecting my health in ways I hadn't fully recognized. Not just financially, though recovering stolen money and protecting my assets was important for practical reasons. It saved my soul. It preserved the essence of who I was beneath all the roles I had played, all the sacrifices I had made, all the compromises I had accepted in the name of family harmony. It reminded me that Rose Kowalski was a person worthy of love and respect, not because of what she could do for others but because of who she was as an individual human being. That her opinions mattered, her feelings were valid, her comfort and safety were important, her autonomy deserved protection. It taught me that fighting for yourself isn't selfish when the alternative is disappearing entirely. That demanding respect isn't demanding too much when you're currently receiving none. That protecting your dignity isn't giving up on love when the pattern you're asked to accept isn't actually love at all. Now, when I wake up each morning in my restored home, I don't have to spend the first few minutes remembering who I'm supposed to be for other people today. I can simply be myself, plan activities that bring me joy, make decisions based on my own preferences and values. When the phone rings, I don't have to brace myself for demands or criticism or emotional manipulation. My remaining family members call because they want to connect with me, not because they need something from me. The conversations are genuine exchanges rather than one-sided extractions. When I look in the mirror, I see a woman who has survived the worst kind of betrayal and emerged stronger, clearer, more authentic than she was before. The lines on my face tell stories of experiences that taught me valuable lessons rather than just marking time spent enduring whatever others chose to put me through. I see someone who knows her worth and insists that others recognize it too. Someone who can distinguish between genuine care and manipulative control. Someone who has learned that aging doesn't mean accepting abuse, that needing help with some things doesn't mean surrendering all autonomy, that family love should enhance your life rather than diminish it. The volunteer work I do continues to be both heartbreaking and healing. I meet so many older adults who are trapped in situations similar to what I experienced, who don't know they have options, who believe they deserve whatever treatment their families choose to give them. I share my story not to encourage family conflict or legal battles, but to help people recognize that they have value independent of their usefulness to others. That respect isn't something they need to earn through endless sacrifice, but something they deserve simply for being human. Some of the people I work with choose to fight back as I did, pursuing legal action and cutting ties with exploitative relationships. Others find different paths to safety and dignity, sometimes through family mediation, sometimes through gradual boundary setting, sometimes through building alternative support systems that reduce their dependence on problematic relationships. There isn't one right way to respond to elder abuse or family exploitation. But there is one wrong way, accepting it as inevitable, normal, or deserved. Every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their age, their level of dependence, or their relationship to the people around them. Every person deserves to have their autonomy respected, their opinions valued, their comfort and safety prioritized. These aren't special privileges earned through good behavior or granted as rewards for compliance. They are basic human rights that don't expire when you turn 60 or 70 or 80 or 90. The support group I'm part of continues to meet monthly, and our numbers have grown as word spreads about our work. We've become informal advocates for each other, accompanying members to legal appointments, helping with research about senior resources, providing emotional support during difficult family negotiations. But perhaps most importantly, we serve as living proof that it's possible to survive family betrayal and build fulfilling lives afterward. We demonstrate that dignity can be reclaimed, that happiness is possible even after devastating loss, that your value doesn't disappear just because some people failed to recognize it. The photography classes I started during my recovery have led to exhibitions and awards I never expected. My pictures of elderly faces, neighborhood gardens, and everyday moments of beauty have been displayed at community centers and senior facilities throughout the city. But the most meaningful recognition came from a young social worker who approached me after seeing my exhibition at the Department on Aging. "Mrs. Kowalski," she said, "I've been working with elderly clients for 3 years, and I thought I understood what elder abuse looked like. But your photographs of seniors living with dignity, pursuing their interests, making their own choices, they showed me what the opposite of abuse looks like. They showed me what we should be working toward, not just what we should be preventing." That comment reminded me that survival isn't enough. It's not sufficient to simply escape abuse or prevent exploitation. The goal is to create lives worth living, relationships worth having, families that enhance rather than diminish the people in them. My relationship with my remaining grandchildren continues to evolve. The older ones, like Lily, understand what happened and have chosen to maintain relationships with me based on genuine affection and respect. The younger ones are gradually rebuilding trust and connection through supervised visits and family therapy. They've had to grapple with difficult questions about right and wrong, about family loyalty versus individual conscience, about the difference between loving someone and enabling their bad behavior. These are challenging concepts for young people, but working through them has made them more thoughtful, more empathetic, more committed to treating others with dignity. Lily, now in graduate school, often brings her classmates to meet me when they're studying elder abuse or family exploitation. I've become an unofficial case study, someone who can put a human face on statistics and research findings. My grandmother is proof that fighting back is possible, she tells them. She's proof that older adults can advocate for themselves effectively, that families can change and grow, that justice is possible even when the system seems stacked against seniors. But beyond serving as an educational resource, these young social workers remind me that the next generation is being trained to recognize and prevent the kind of treatment I experienced. They give me hope that fewer families will be able to get away with systematically abusing their elderly members, that more resources will be available for seniors who need help protecting themselves. This summer, I took my first real vacation in over a decade. Not a family obligation disguised as recreation, not a trip planned around everyone else's schedules and preferences, but a journey I chose because it appealed to me. I went to Yellowstone National Park with Margaret, my photography friend, and we spent a week capturing landscapes and wildlife through our camera lenses. We stayed in a comfortable lodge, ate meals we enjoyed, followed our own schedule without having to accommodate anyone else's needs or opinions. It was the first time in years that I had traveled somewhere without worrying about what was happening at home, without feeling guilty for spending money on myself, without having to justify my choices to anyone else. The freedom was intoxicating. Not just the freedom to travel, but the freedom to enjoy myself without explaining or apologizing, to make spontaneous decisions without consulting anyone, to prioritize my own happiness without feeling selfish. Standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon of Yellowstone, watching the river carve its path through ancient rock, I thought about the metaphor of erosion and persistence. How constant pressure over time can change even the most solid foundations. How sometimes destruction creates beauty, reveals layers that were hidden, opens up new possibilities. My family's betrayal had eroded my old life completely, stripping away assumptions and expectations I had carried for decades. But like that river carving through stone, the pressure had revealed something valuable: my own resilience, my capacity for growth, my ability to create beauty from destruction. The woman who stood at that overlook was fundamentally different from the one who had discovered her violated home 5 years earlier. Not broken but rebuilt, not bitter but wiser, not isolated but selective about the company she kept. That evening, I called Sarah from my hotel room to share pictures of the day's adventures. Our conversation was natural and warm, full of genuine interest in each other's lives rather than underlying tension or unspoken obligations. "Mom, you sound so happy," she said. "Happier than I remember you being in years." She was right. I was happier than I had been in years, maybe in decades. Not because I had everything I wanted, but because I had stopped accepting things I didn't want. Not because my life was perfect, but because it was mine. The happiness came from alignment between my values and my actions, between my worth and my treatment, between my needs and my choices. It came from living authentically rather than performatively, from building relationships based on mutual respect rather than uneven obligation. When I returned from that trip, I found a letter waiting that surprised me more than Michael's apology had. It was from Diane. Not a greeting card with a generic message, but a handwritten letter that clearly represented significant effort and emotional work. She began by acknowledging that she had no right to contact me after what she had done, but wanted to take responsibility for her actions without expecting forgiveness or response. The letter was an exhaustive catalogue of her crimes against me, with detailed admissions of planning and premeditation that went far beyond what I had originally understood. She had been systematically stealing from me for over 2 years before I discovered the credit card fraud, forging my signature on documents I had never seen, researching nursing homes and senior communities without my knowledge. But more shockingly, she admitted to deliberately destroying the photographs and keepsakes she found in my basement, not accidentally during cleaning but intentionally as part of what she called erasing your past so you couldn't resist our plans for your future. The destruction of my memories hadn't been careless or insensitive. It had been calculated and cruel, designed to make me more compliant by eliminating connections to my previous life and identity. Reading that admission was devastating but also validating. It confirmed that my response hadn't been an overreaction to ordinary family conflict, but an appropriate response to systematic psychological abuse designed to break my spirit and eliminate my resistance. Diane's letter went on to describe the therapy she had been attending since the divorce, her growing understanding of her own manipulative patterns, her recognition that what she had done to me was criminal not just legally but morally. I convinced myself that older people naturally become difficult and resistant to help, she wrote, but the truth is that I was manufacturing problems to justify solutions that served my interests rather than your needs. I was gaslighting you into believing that your legitimate objections to abuse were symptoms of mental decline. She described how she had researched elder abuse tactics online, studying methods used by other family members to gain control of elderly relatives' assets and autonomy. The violation of my home hadn't been impulsive or accidental, it had been planned and executed using information she had gathered about how to systematically break down an older person's defenses. But the most chilling part of her confession was her admission that she had viewed me as already essentially dead, a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. I stopped seeing you as Michael's mother and started seeing you as an obstacle to our family's financial security, she wrote. I convinced myself that you had already lived your life and that what happened to you didn't matter as much as what happened to us. That kind of thinking allowed me to do things to you that I would never have done to someone I recognized as fully human. The letter concluded with an apology that made no demands and offered no excuses, acknowledging that the damage she had done couldn't be repaired and that I had every right to hate her forever. I read the letter several times, feeling a complex mix of vindication and sadness. Vindication because her admissions confirmed that my perceptions had been accurate, that the abuse had been even worse than I had realized, that my decision to fight back had been completely justified. But sadness too, because the letter revealed the depth of her contempt for elderly people in general and me in particular. It showed how easily she had been able to dehumanize me, to justify cruelty by categorizing me as less deserving of consideration than younger family members. I shared the letter with Dr. Williams during our next session, and her response was both professional and personal. Rose, this letter describes classic elder abuse psychology. The perpetrator stops seeing the victim as a fully human being deserving of respect and dignity. Once that dehumanization happens, any level of mistreatment becomes justifiable because the victim's pain is no longer considered real or important. She talked about how common this pattern is in families, how adult children often begin to view their aging parents as possessions rather than people, resources to be managed rather than individuals to be honored. What makes your case particularly significant, she continued, is that you recognized what was happening and fought back effectively. Many victims of elder abuse never recover their sense of self-worth or their belief that they deserve better treatment. You not only survived but transformed the experience into growth and advocacy. That conversation helped me understand why sharing my story had become so important to me. It wasn't about seeking attention or sympathy, but about providing proof that recovery was possible, that fighting back could succeed, that elderly people could advocate effectively for themselves when they had support and resources. Over the past year, I've been working with Mary Morrison to develop educational materials about elder abuse prevention and response. We've created workshops for seniors about recognizing exploitation, understanding their rights, accessing legal resources. But we've also developed training for family members about how to provide genuine support without violating autonomy, how to have difficult conversations about aging and independence without resorting to manipulation or control. The key, Mary often says during these presentations, is remembering that needing help with some things doesn't mean surrendering control over everything. Aging doesn't eliminate your right to make decisions about your own life, even if some of those decisions seem imperfect to other people. That principle has guided my own continued aging process. I've had to accept help with some things as my arthritis has progressed and my energy levels have changed. But I've been careful to distinguish between accepting appropriate assistance and surrendering inappropriate control. I have a cleaning service that comes twice a month, but I chose the company and the schedule. I have a handyman who helps with heavy maintenance tasks, but I decide what work needs to be done and when. I sometimes ask neighbors to pick up groceries when they're going to the store, but I make my own shopping lists and pay my own bills. The help I accept enhances my independence rather than undermining it. It allows me to continue living safely in my own home while acknowledging realistic limitations that come with aging. But I've also learned to be vigilant about the difference between genuine offers of help and attempts to gain control. I listen carefully to how assistance is offered, whether my preferences are respected, whether I'm being consulted or simply informed about decisions that affect my life. The network of friends and support I've built over the past few years has made this kind of discernment easier. When you have multiple people who genuinely care about your well-being, it's harder for any one person to manipulate you into accepting inappropriate treatment. Mrs. Patterson, who is now 87 and dealing with her own aging challenges, has become not just a neighbor but a true friend. We look out for each other without trying to control each other, offer help without expecting gratitude, respect each other's autonomy while providing mutual support. Rose, she said to me recently, watching you fight for yourself taught me that I don't have to accept whatever my children decide is best for me either. I can have opinions about my own life even at my age. Those words reminded me that the impact of standing up for yourself extends beyond your own situation. Other people are watching how you handle challenges, learning from your example, drawing courage from your courage. Every time I refuse to accept disrespectful treatment, I'm modeling for other women that such treatment isn't inevitable or deserved. Every time I insist on being included in decisions that affect my life, I'm demonstrating that elderly people can and should advocate for themselves. Every time I choose dignity over harmony, self-respect over family peace, authentic connection over superficial inclusion, I'm showing others that these choices are possible even when they're difficult. The ripple effects of my decision to fight back continue to surprise me. Lily's classmates have gone on to work in elder advocacy with a deeper understanding of what abuse looks like and what recovery requires. Sarah's daughters have grown up with a different model of how to treat elderly family members, one based on respect rather than obligation. Even Michael's other children, despite the pain of their parents' divorce, have learned important lessons about accountability and consequences, about the difference between loving someone and enabling their bad behavior. But perhaps most importantly, I've provided myself with proof that it's never too late to save yourself, never too late to demand better, never too late to discover who you really are when you stop trying to be who others want you to be. As I prepare to conclude this story, I want to share what I consider the most valuable lesson from my experience. You are never too old to matter. Your comfort matters. Your preferences matter. Your dignity matters. Your autonomy matters. Your happiness matters. These things don't become less important as you age. They don't become optional when other people find respecting them inconvenient. They don't disappear when you need help with some aspects of daily living. You have the right to live safely and with dignity in your own space, whether that's the home you've lived in for decades or a new place you choose based on your own assessment of your needs. You have the right to make decisions about your own life, even if other people think those decisions are imperfect or unwise. You have the right to spend your own money on things that bring you joy, even if others think that money should be saved for their inheritance or used for expenses they consider more practical. You have the right to relationships that are based on genuine affection and mutual respect rather than duty, obligation, or convenience. You have the right to say no to treatment that diminishes you, even if accepting such treatment would be easier for other people. You have the right to fight back when these rights are violated, to seek help when you're being exploited, to pursue justice when crimes are committed against you. These rights don't require you to be perfect. They don't require you to be completely independent. They don't require you to never make mistakes or never need assistance. They simply require you to be human, which you will be until the day you die, regardless of your age or your circumstances. Have you ever felt like you were disappearing in your own life? Have you ever accepted treatment that diminished you because you feared the alternative was complete loneliness? Have you ever wondered if fighting back was worth the cost when the fight was against people you loved? I want you to know that you're not alone in those feelings. I want you to know that confusion between love and exploitation is common, especially in families. I want you to know that the fear of abandonment can make us accept terrible treatment from people who should be protecting us. But I also want you to know that fighting back is possible. That recovery is possible. That dignity can be reclaimed. That happiness can be rebuilt even after devastating betrayal. That it's never too late to save yourself. If my story resonates with you, if you've recognized your own experiences in what I've shared, please know that help is available. Elder law attorneys, senior advocacy organizations, adult protective services, support groups, counselors who specialize in family trauma, there are people who understand what you're going through and can help you navigate the path towards safety and dignity. You don't have to accept abuse as the price of family connection. You don't have to surrender your autonomy to receive care. You don't have to choose between being loved and being respected. You can demand both. You can insist on both. You deserve both. Please don't disappear quietly. Please don't accept dignity as the price of inclusion. Please don't sacrifice yourself in the hope that your sacrifice will be enough to guarantee love. Fight for yourself. Stand up for yourself. Save yourself. The world needs the wisdom you've accumulated, the perspective you've gained, the strength you've developed through surviving all the challenges life has brought you. Don't let anyone convince you that your time is over, that your opinions don't matter, that your comfort is less important than their convenience. You matter. Your life matters. Your happiness matters. Never let anyone tell you otherwise. If you found value in my story, if it gave you hope or courage or simply helped you feel less alone in your struggles, please share it with others who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below telling me about your own experiences or the experiences of elderly people you care about. Let's build a community of people who believe that dignity doesn't have an expiration date, that respect isn't something that has to be earned through endless sacrifice, that love should enhance rather than diminish the people it touches. Like this video if it resonated with you. Subscribe to help me reach other people who need to know they're not alone and that fighting back is possible. Together, we can change the conversation about aging and family relationships. Together, we can insist that elderly people be treated as full human beings deserving of respect and dignity. Together, we can make sure that no one disappears quietly when they still have so much life left to live. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring about the experiences of elderly people who are too often invisible or marginalized. Thank you for believing that dignity matters at every age. Remember, you are worth fighting for. Always.